the dark legacy of Australia's notorious paedophile priest. The passing of Gerald Ridsdale in prison marks the end of a dark chapter in Australian history, but it does not signify closure for the survivors of his appalling abuses. As Australia's most infamous paedophile priest, Ridsdale's crimes and the systemic failures that enabled his decades-long abuses have left indelible marks on individuals, families, and communities. This video examines his sinister legacy and the ongoing need for institutional accountability and advocacy to support abuse survivors. Gerald Ridsdale was ordained as a priest in 1961, marking the beginning of his predatory abuse. Over 3 decades, he sexually assaulted more than 70 children across regional Victoria, often during one-on-one encounters facilitated by his trusted positions in the community. Ridsdale's actions, characterized by their cruelty and premeditation, earned him the tragic title of Australia's most notorious paedophile priest. His crimes extended beyond physical abuse to long-lasting emotional scars for survivors and their families. Despite dozens of allegations brought to the attention of church authorities, Ridsdale was consistently shielded by the Catholic Church, a systemic failure that allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. The actions of high-ranking church officials, including deliberately transferring him to new parishes to avoid a public scandal, compounded the survivors' suffering. The survivors of Ridsdale's crimes face a lifetime of struggles. Their victimization extended beyond the initial acts of abuse to trust betrayed by an institution they revered. Personal stories from survivors highlight cycles of shame, guilt, and intense psychological distress. Many have struggled with relationships, jobs, and mental health issues because of the trauma inflicted not just by Ridsdale, but by the systemic enablers of his crimes. For survivors, healing often feels out of reach. While the death of their abuser may spur mixed emotions, few feel it represents true closure. Advocacy groups such as Bravehearts emphasize that trauma does not simply vanish because the perpetrator has passed away. It lingers, unmitigated by symbolic ends to dark chapters. Ridsdale was first arrested and convicted in 1993, ultimately receiving a maximum of 40 years imprisonment. Yet, survivors and advocates question whether the punishment fits the enormity of his crimes. Decades of systemic negligence, the Church's obstruction of justice, and the sheer scale of abuse inflicted mean the judicial outcomes often feel woefully inadequate. While Ridsdale's imprisonment marked some semblance of justice, it hardly addressed the core issues that enabled his actions. Many feel justice would extend beyond punitive measures, encompassing accountability for those who facilitated Ridsdale's acts and systemic reforms to prevent future abuses. Ridsdale's abuses were enabled by a deliberate institutional cover-up. The Catholic Church prioritized its reputation over the welfare of children, actively transferring Ridsdale from parish to parish despite clear evidence of his offending. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse starkly illuminated these failures. Senior clergy knowingly allowed Ridsdale to continue abusing children under the guise of rehabilitation programs, including sending him to the United States for treatment. Shocking details emerged about powerful figures, including Cardinal George Pell, who lived with Ridsdale and later claimed ignorance of his crimes. The Commission found such claims implausible, given the transparency of complaints against Ridsdale among church leadership at the time. Bravehearts and other advocacy groups have long pushed for changes to child protection legislation, survivor support systems, and institutional accountability. The legacy of Ridsdale's abuse has been a rallying point for reforms, but advocates remind us the fight for systemic change is far from over. These groups continue to work tirelessly to dismantle the structures that allowed Ridsdale to operate and bring attention to survivor needs. It is a solemn reminder that preventing future tragedies requires comprehensive efforts to listen, to act, and to protect vulnerable populations. Amid the horrors perpetuated by Ridsdale, the resilience of survivors shines. Many have stepped forward to advocate for others, drawing strength from their personal pain to support healing and reform. Their courage underscores the vital role of community and advocacy in addressing trauma head-on. Support services, peer networks, and legal reforms remain critical tools in empowering these voices. Survivors have demonstrated remarkable tenacity, demanding not just recognition but meaningful action from lawmakers, institutions, and society at large. The death of Gerald Ridsdale signifies an end to his personal capacity for harm, but not to the impact or lessons his crimes impart. It is a time for reflection and recommitment, reflection on the failures that allowed such atrocities to be perpetrated, and recommitment to the survivors who live with the consequences every day. This story serves as a grave reminder that justice, accountability, and prevention are more than words. They are responsibilities that demand all of our vigilance. We owe it to the survivors, the communities affected, and future generations to ensure that institutions are held accountable and that changes demanded in the wake of tragedies like Ridsdale's cannot be ignored. Let this be a call to honor survivors by strengthening child protection laws, supporting advocacy groups, and fostering a culture that prioritizes safeguarding the vulnerable. True justice lies beyond punishing a single individual. It resides in the systemic change that prevents abuse and supports healing trajectories for those who have suffered so deeply.